Central to that is the need to inject competition back into the system. The centralisation of healthcare services, and I've seen that in my state, for minuscule savings because of alleged economies of scale, and neglects the whole question of diseconomies that come from reducing competition and the ability to manage those hospitals. And that's a challenge that we have. The issue is to put this on the agenda. That's why I'm happy to talk to business groups. Every time, I said this last week to the New South Wales Chamber, I don't have really that much sympathy with the argument that says cut payroll tax by 0.5%, and that's the big issue that the business community has. If that's your big issue, fine. You've missed the big picture. You need to start focusing in on what I'm talking about, because there are many appropriate savings. See, what people don't understand is that we're not facing an environment of what taxes you reduce. We're facing an environment of what taxes you increase. And one of the things that I find frightening about the Ken Henry review is that it's not looking at expenditure. So I can give you a prediction that that review will not come up with anything that's meaningful in terms of reform to the tax system. It may play at the edge in terms of some forms of federal taxation, but unless it deals with the expenditure side of it, it can't have a meaningful tax reform. And if you deal with the expenditure side, that means you've got to deal with the issues I'm talking about. People ask me, does that mean abolishing the states? Well, look, I'm a decentralist by nature, but I've got to say that the erosion of the state's ability to fund the services that it's responsible for really does raise the question about what is the role of the states going forward. I said at lunch today that I'd still keep them because we need state of origin teams, and the public wouldn't allow us to abolish them, but whether they actually function as the core service delivery mechanism, or whether you have larger regional structures in conjunction with the state, is really something that's open to debate. What I want to raise is the fact that this debate is the one you should be having, and if I was a member of the business community, this is where I'd be facing my issues. Now, the ageing of the population, again, in that report that Peter Costello commissioned, and Ken Henry made a number of comments following it. I don't know if you've probably heard about the 3 Ps he believes are the solution to the problem, and those 3 Ps are population, productivity, and participation. I probably don't need to explain that, but very quickly, we've got to increase our population, either through getting our fertility rates back to replacement and beyond. We've made some progress on that, but they're still below. It's the immigration program that's holding this up, holding the population numbers up. And I'll deal with productivity last because there's an issue there. The second issue is that on? Is participation. Basically, we saw that in the large budget, at least in a symbolic sense, and that is people working longer and expectations for retirement being put on the back burner whilst we deal with these issues. I mean, there's huge cultural issues in getting people to accept older people in the workforce, but certainly that's a sensible strategy. The issue is productivity. Now, there's 2 components to this, and whenever I talk about this, people like to talk about productivity in the workforce, and usually the private sector workforce, but when I point out that productivity also needs to apply to the public sector workforce, which takes nearly 30% of national income, people tend to walk away from this and say, well, look, if there's an argument for productivity improvements to deal with this problem, it has to apply to public sector service delivery as well. And there are some massive challenges in that area. To highlight part of the problem, it goes back to what I said initially in terms of my memoirs. We're going to have to make some very difficult decisions about what governments do and what they can't do. We've had the luxury, particularly in Australia, of being able to deal with a broad range of problems. Every time an interest group pops up, we throw a couple of grants at them and buy off the interest group and feel comfortable that we've met our responsibilities in that area. But it gets even worse, so I'm sure this happens here, and certainly happened in New South Wales. We fund advocacy groups to come out and attack the government. One of the worst things we ever did in New South Wales was fund an office called the Environmental Defender's Office, which basically challenges all our government decisions in terms of planning. So you've got this absurd situation: the government makes a decision for economic development, goes through the normal process. A bunch of people object to it, usually the same ones. And they use government funds, partially use government funds, to try and overturn the decision. Sometimes they're lucky enough to do it, as they did a couple of years ago in one of our coal mines, and were able to overturn the decision based on the spurious reason that the development process hadn't taken into account the impacts of global warming. So what does that mean? We do another report, and that costs everybody a lot more money, and I don't know what it's like in Tasmania, but I'm sure it's the same. Every development that's anywhere near the coast now has got to have a sea level report, just in case sea levels rise, and that's another consultant, another industry that's spurned doing those sorts of things. It's good if you're in it, but it certainly adds to the cost of doing business. And they're the issues I think that business needs to address, those issues. The sort of lazy business constituency that just runs around harping on about small changes to payroll tax and doesn't put much effort into these sorts of issues, I think is missing the point. Sorry?
Well said.
Who's that? You part of the chamber?
So, Michael, you need to be reassured too that there's no trouble with development applications in Tasmania whatsoever.
Well, I can believe that now that we've got a new federal minister that has decided. I'm glad you raised this. You've got to be fair in politics, and one of the things that Malcolm Turnbull did do when he was Environment Minister, he delegated responsibility for the processes under the federal acts to the states, and so people didn't have to go through a dual process. Since our the ball bloke, we always worry about ball blokes, got the job, he's now reinstituted a dual process, and we have all sorts of problems in dealing with that. But look, my point is, and state, federal financial arrangements are the next area for reform. Micro reform needs to be focused in that area. If it's not focused in that area, we have some major challenges. Now, I'm going to talk about, are you winding me up? No.
Not at all.
No, okay, I want to talk about the role of government, and then I'll come back to the stimulus and the global financial crisis, because today we saw an example of what happens when you get those sorts of policies wrong. In terms of government, I really do think that Milton Friedman once said that there's 4 ways to spend people's money. I don't know if people have heard this. Have people heard this? Well, you have, but the rest of you haven't. He said that, look, there's 4 ways you can spend money. You can spend your own money on yourself, and you tend to be careful about it, your budgets, though that's less true today than it was when he said that statement with credit facilities. There's also, you can spend your money on somebody else, a child, a gift or anything else, and that seems to have some constraints in it. If you spend somebody else's money on you, be it your employer, you go out to lunch and you're worried about, you've got an expense account, but you don't want the boss to think you've been to the most expensive restaurant and had the second most expensive bottle of wine on the menu, so you're still careful of that. But the worst way to spend money is to spend somebody else's money on somebody else. Now, he defined that as government, and I think he's absolutely wrong. And what he showed is that because of that way of spending money, we see national income now at 30% in the government sector. And it is a problem. Special interest capture of government processes is very difficult to combat. Why do we have a tourism department and not a department for bakers? Why do we have a department for tourism and not a department for motor mechanics? I don't know. Well, what makes tourism so important? What makes tourism so important, and it's not a criticism because it happens everywhere, is that governments have decided, in the face of an inability to directly intervene in the economy, that through tourism they can achieve 2 things. They can market the state, which is good for them because the Premier and everybody else is on that, and plus you can realistically and almost directly quantify some of the outcomes of that. That's fine, I have no problem with that, but it doesn't mean that that ought to be your government's economic development strategy.